When logic is misapplied, throughout history the rules of logic have often been misapplied, resulting in conclusions which are nonsense. It must be stressed that Aristotle, who is best known for inventing the system of formal logic, was wrong about nearly every conclusion he made about the physical sciences. This is primarily because, like his teacher Plato, Aristotle believed the human mind contains innate knowledge that is true, which can be used as the basis for deduction. Aristotle also believed any conclusion drawn by a logical argument could produce new kinds of truths. Aristotle was mistaken in these assertions because the human mind is highly fallible, and we require our deductions to be based on truth in order for our deductions to reveal other truths. If our deductions are based on nonsense, then these conclusions will be also nonsense. It can of course be possible to produce a conclusion that is true, even if one makes an error in logical process. But the entire formula will be incorrect, and that is the point. Because the formula is flawed, it cannot be used to reliably investigate other subjects and arrive at a true conclusion all of the time. As with all things, the system of logic has strengths and limitations. Logic is only useful when guided by facts. When methods of logical reasoning are applied to factoids or distinctly implausible scenarios, it can produce only nonsense. Therefore, logic should never be applied to premises that have never been observed in reality, nor which cannot be verified through experimentation. Furthermore, when there is ambiguity in the language of an argument, logic cannot produce useful results. This is why I can criticize so harshly those pseudoscientific methods which rely on survey data collected from only a small portion of a population. Logic can only be applied to that which is known. It cannot draw accurate conclusions when it relies on faulty data. If you survey 100 people within a group of 1 million people, there's no guarantee you can use the survey results from those 100 people to predict the responses of the remaining 999,900 people. To believe that you can is to engage in academic dishonesty. This is because a person's responses to a survey question are not consistent like something else in nature, such as the force of gravity, which always produces a consistent result. By contrast, an individual person's answers to a question depends on the condition of their brain, and therefore their answer is impacted by motivations to lie, recalled memories contradicting reality, selection biases, limitations in reading comprehension, and so on. An individual person's answers cannot be measured the same way as natural forces like gravity, heat, and light can be. Sadly, it is a common mistake for people to attempt to do so and then claim their conclusions to be scientific. We must always remember that logic alone cannot reveal the truth of reality. Logic must be guided by keen observations and discipline of one's emotions, so that we do not accept a statement of fact which is actually a factoid. For example, suppose a man is standing in a doorway to a room and the question, "Is this man in the room or not?" is asked. Certain individuals may say he is not in the room, as they assert he is in the doorway, but they may simultaneously also claim that the man is also in the room, since the doorway is viewed as a halfway point between the room and the area outside the room. This contradictory conclusion, however, is irrational and based on an ambiguous usage of language to form the conclusion. Physically, the man is either in the room or he is not. But whether he is in the room is defined by our perceptions of what the borders of the room are. If the room is defined as the space beyond the doorway, then he is not in the room. And if the room is defined to include the space within the doorway, then he is in the room. If the doorway is considered separate from the room, then he is not in the room. In the latter case, even if the man extends his arm into the room, it is only his arm that is in the room, with the rest of him retained outside the room. So if the question is asked in this case, then the correct answer is, his arm is in the room and the rest of him is not. Again, any contradiction only appears due to ambiguity in the language used. When we replace ambiguous language with more defined statements, the contradictions vanish. As I have said before, it is possible to observe something and come to the incorrect conclusion about what is observed. If you believe you have observed a contradiction, then you have only misunderstood what you have observed, for contradictions do not appear in the universe. This is a rule of logic, the law of non-contradiction that many sociologists ignore. It is important to stress that many attempts have been made to discredit the rules of logic. For example, there is the so-called barber paradox, which says, the barber is the one who shaves all those, and those only who do not shave themselves. The question is, does the barber shave himself? Concluding that the barber does shave himself creates a contradiction in the statement. The problem with this thought experiment, like many others which seek to discredit the laws of logic, is with people confusing things they believe can be plausible with things that actually exist. In reality, there is no real barber who only shaves people who do not shave themselves. In fact, there exists more than one barber in our reality, and not a single all-powerful barber who is the only one capable of being a barber. The barber paradox is therefore not a genuine paradox, but incorrectly labeled as such when people confuse what is possible in our imaginations for what is possible in reality. I can imagine an invisible pink unicorn. That does not mean that it exists. Some philosophers delude themselves into believing that thought experiments that overly simplify a situation are useful because it allows contingent facts to get out of the way of the principle they wish to study. Yet again, the problem with this is that they have created a scenario that will conveniently result in the answer they wish to arrive at, even if it is impossible to arrive at that answer in reality. Logic can only be expected to reveal truth when it is applied to things that truly exist. It is a common trap for people to design thought experiments using imaginary rules to create impossible scenarios that would never occur in reality and try to claim they are plausible. But you cannot use falsities to discredit truth. To attempt such a thing is completely irrational. Another common thought experiment that attempts to discredit logic is the liar's paradox, which is where a person says, "I am always lying." If the liar is telling the truth, a contradiction is created in the statement. This again is a fallacious argument. Logic is designed to discover objective truth by measuring things which are real. Obviously, the liar is being irrational here and not speaking the truth. Thus, their claim is untrue. The liar is free to make contradictory statements, as people often do, but contradictory statements made by a person have zero impact on whether the rules of logic are coherent. Furthermore, no person can truly always be a liar because they cannot lie to themselves about what they believe and think. To lie requires one to be aware they are not telling the truth. So it is impossible to deceive oneself in order to lie to others. If the liar's paradox is to be accepted as rational, then anyone might be able to say anything and we would have to accept their statement at face value of being true, no matter how far removed from reality the statement is. This is simply not how logic works. The thought experiment of the liar's paradox is built on intellectually dishonest grounds to start with, as it is designed to apply the objective rules of reality to an impossible scenario that would never exist in reality. As it does not exist in reality, we cannot observe that the rules of reality apply to it. In my opinion, people who take the conclusions from thought experiments, whose circumstances rely on unrealistic scenarios, and then attempt to connect the conclusions to the real world, are engaging in a form of psychosis. It is a form of magical thinking that masquerades as science and logic, but upon careful consideration really is not. Some of these philosophers might consider my deductions to be evasive, but this only places them in the same company as religious apologists, who insist that intelligent design must be real solely because nature is complicated. Religious beliefs such as creation myths are themselves a type of thought experiment designed with the end result in mind. The storyteller seeking reasonable-sounding explanations for observed principles. For example, the metaphysical stories that were created to explain why snakes don't have legs, or why people wear clothing, resulting in the mythmaker working the problem back in reverse so that circumstances exist in the thought experiment that justify the observed principle. This is myth-making when the same thing happens with a person claiming to be a scientist or philosopher, and who relies entirely on a self-conjured thought experiment with no other evidence for their conclusions. Creative storytelling used for logic and science must be rooted in reality, else they become merely fantasies that provide no useful information of relevance for good decision-making. Other problems of logic come when people try to apply a pseudo-mathematical formula to logic, and people mistake the limits of this formula based on logical symbols, and think such a thing can be used to create paradoxes that disprove the rules of logic. When you play abstract games such as transforming a logical argument into a mathematical formula and remove the facts of the argument, you do not reproduce the argument but instead assume all logical arguments so made are predicated on statements of fact, even if the statement is unrealistic. So, while this kind of thing may appeal to mathematicians, it is once again a form of intellectual dishonesty. This is because mathematical formulas and logical symbols do not exist in reality. They are products of the human mind, part of the language of mathematics used to allow us to measure and label forces that actually exist. As such, mathematics must only be applied to things that actually exist in order for the system to produce realistic results. When mathematics is applied to things that do not exist, new things do not spring into existence as a result. This may be confusing to some, so let me be definite. When I create on paper a math problem of having 5 apples and taking 2 apples away to have a remainder of 3 apples, there are in fact absolutely 0 apples created and destroyed in reality. What I have done is merely imagine apples. While apples do in fact exist in reality, logic does not create apples. It merely is a tool for expressing reality. When we use logic to define reality rather than to explain what is real, we employ logic incorrectly. Logic is not a language of magical spell weaving. It is a system we created to measure reality. When applied to scenarios that cannot exist in reality, it produces only nonsense. If I were to replace apples with invisible pink unicorns, then the same mathematical problem becomes meaningless because it seeks to resolve a problem that does not exist, because invisible pink unicorns do not exist. Merely because you can imagine them existing does not make them exist. And because they do not exist, you cannot apply the rules of reality to them as you can a group of apples. And it is a deception of the mind to automatically assume the rules of reality can be equally applied to non-reality. This is a common problem for some gifted computer programmers who confuse the virtual worlds of computer programs for being synonymous with the way the real world operates. For the model to be accurate, the model must reflect all relevant conditions of reality that factor into the thing to be researched. So, it is foolish to confuse a mathematical formula for being reality. While math can be used to hypothesize about how things may play out in reality, it is only relevant about that which can actually take place in reality. It is surprising to me that more logisticians do not realize this and cease engaging in their intellectual masturbation, constantly obsessed with certain mathematical formulas which have absolutely 0 relevance to reality. If you start with an inherently untrue statement, you will only end up with an untrue statement. Logic must begin with a true statement. Otherwise, you are merely employing logic against the irrationality of your own imagination. Logic is intended to be employed to eliminate the fictitious thoughts we possess. Applying logic to a fictitious idea you assume is true is not at all rational. Thus, while logic may be applied to any kind of arguments, if the employer of logic fails to acknowledge an argument is unrealistic, then logic will only be employed improperly and produce conclusions that cannot possibly be true. It is also important to understand that mathematics is based on observations about the universe, and it is not a rule set developed by the universe, because as I have pointed out in prior chapters, the universe is an abstract term for everything in reality. It doesn't have consciousness, and it doesn't have a language. Mathematics is a human-created language, and while centuries of collective experimentation have made it a largely accurate system for measuring the natural forces in the universe, it is not perfect. There are legitimate problems with it, and there is no need to be depressed about this because math is not some magical thing invented by a higher power. Mathematics is just a tool humans use to measure reality. Math doesn't give your life purpose any more than a screwdriver gives your life purpose. Math, like logic, is a tool. Humans are a species that use tools. Do not become a slave to a tool. Implausible logic and justice. There are some people who create unrealistic thought experiments to discredit the idea that justice can exist in a moral system that argues that a person should protect the helpless, and it is immoral to do otherwise. Typically, these thought experiments seek to prove that justice is an impossible attempt to do so by creating an utterly unrealistic scenario. For example, they may say that a madman has given Bob a gun and told him he must kill a baby, otherwise a group of 5 babies will be killed. Bob is given the ethical choice of choosing to kill one baby, or allowing the madman to kill the group of 5 babies. Those who would disprove justice claim this forces Bob into having to kill the one to save the 5. However, the problem with these sorts of thought experiments is they are unrealistic. Firstly, Bob has no reason to believe that a madman who wants him to make a decision like this actually intends to spare the lives of the 5 babies. To place Bob into a situation like this, we can induce that the madman has another motivation, aside from simply killing babies, else the choice would not be presented to Bob in the first place. It is possible the madman is trying to cause Bob misery by asking Bob to make this choice. So if the situation were to be real, there are more than 2 outcomes in this scenario. Even if Bob kills the one baby, the madman may still kill the other 5 in order to torment Bob and show his efforts were pointless and saved no one. This would maximize the infliction of misery onto Bob, if the madman's motivation truly is to hurt Bob. So killing the one is not guaranteed to achieve the goal of saving the 5. If Bob wants to save anyone, the most certain way for Bob to do this is to kill the madman who threatens their lives. Therefore, the most just choice is for Bob to apprehend or kill the madman, and not to kill the baby. If the madman is apprehended or dead, neither the baby nor Bob is threatened anymore. Now, the scenario with Bob and the madman may seem ridiculous, as you may wonder what kind of person would make someone choose between killing infants. But this sort of thing, an evil person making a victim choose which of their children they want to be murdered, does happen as a method of control and torture in certain dictatorial-led communities. There are also cases in cults where leaders force a person to choose between harshly punishing a child for rule breaking or face punishment themselves from the group. When people in these actual situations fail to realize the dilemma has more than two outcomes, and that the evil individual asking them to make this choice may actually have no intentions to spare anyone, it makes a person in this situation unable to do the truly just thing: resist against evil and protect everyone. A citizen in a dictatorial society can rise up and resist against the dictator, and a cult member does not need to remain a member of a cult that demands them to carry out unjust acts. Let us look at another realistic example. Let us suppose a scenario where someone has been kidnapped and the kidnapper has asked for ransom. This does actually happen. Terrorist and criminal organizations will often turn to kidnapping to generate revenue through ransoms in order to fund their illegal operations. We know from assessments of these scenarios that more than half of the time the kidnappers never return the ransom victim. Even when the families pay the ransoms, the victims are either held to extort more money from the family or simply killed. Thus, there is no guarantee that cooperating with evil people will lead to the safe return of a victim, while any money earned by the criminals through ransoming is guaranteed to be spent on funding future kidnappings and other kinds of evil behavior. The just act is to not pay the ransom and work to hold the kidnappers accountable for their crime of kidnapping by capturing them. To not pay the ransom should not be viewed as abandoning the kidnapped victim, because the families do not have any real control over the behavior of the kidnappers, and the kidnappers probably will not release the victim anyway, since releasing victims is not profitable. It is the kidnappers who have done evil, and who must be held accountable for this behavior in order for justice to be obtained. Thus, giving in to the ransom demands does not lead to justice for the victim. The victim is likely to be killed regardless, which is tragic. The important takeaway from all of this is that logic cannot be applied to things that are completely implausible and unrealistic. Doing so can only produce untrue conclusions. In order for logic to produce accurate results, the person employing it must have integrity, and only apply logic to things which are real,